June 19, 1944. High above the Philippine Sea, the sky is already full of smoke. The young naval aviator pushes his Hellcats throttle forward until the engine's roar drowns out everything else. Ahead and below, tiny specks grow larger by the second. Japanese carrier planes stretched out in a long, ragged line. Some are already trailing fuel and fire. Sunlight flashes from canopies. Tracers streak upward from the American fleet far below, a drifting lattice of red and white. Radio chatter crackles in his ears, bearing calls, contact reports, clipped voices counting kills. Someone laughs, disbelieving, as another Zero blooms into a blackened orange fireball. The Hellcat rolls, drops in behind a climbing fighter with the rising sun on its wings. A short burst, metal shreds, a wing tears away. The Zero tumbles end over end, vanishing into the blue depth beneath them. In minutes, the air is littered with falling wreckage. Parachutes are rare. The sky that once belonged to the Imperial Japanese Navy is now a hunting ground, and the hunters are American. For years, Japanese pilots had boasted that the Mitsubishi A6M0 was untouchable, unbeatable in a dogfight. This is the day that myth dies, but this is not how the war in the Pacific had begun. In 1940, far from the blue emptiness of the Central Pacific, the legend of the Zero was being forged in secret. On airfields outside Nagoya and elsewhere in Japan, engineers and naval officers watched as a new kind of fighter took shape. The Mitsubishi A6M was designed around a single obsession: long-range carrier-based dominance. Every kilogram of weight that could be spared was cut away. Armor plate was rejected. Self-sealing fuel tanks were sacrificed. Even structural strength was limited to what the designers believed a skilled pilot could safely handle. What remained was startling. A nimble light fighter with a huge wingspan and exceptional lift. It could climb faster than most Western aircraft, turn inside almost anything that flew, and roam over vast stretches of ocean thanks to its remarkable range. When Japanese naval aviators first pushed the Zero into a high-G turn and felt it carve the sky like a knife, they knew they were looking at something special. The men chosen to fly it were the product of one of the harshest training systems in the world. Before the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Navy measured pilot training not in months but in years. Only a fraction of candidates survived the process. Those who did were superbly skilled, welded into tight-knit units, and filled with absolute confidence in their aircraft and their empire. By late 1940 and 1941, the Zero was blooded in China, where it brushed aside older Chinese and occasional Soviet-built aircraft. Allied intelligence heard rumors about a new Japanese fighter of extraordinary performance, but reports were vague, scattered, and often dismissed. In London and Washington, the prevailing belief lingered that Japan's aviation industry lagged behind Europe's. The shock, when it came, would be brutal. On 7 December 1941, Zero fighters swept over Pearl Harbor as part of the carrier strike force. While the world's attention focused on burning battleships, naval airmen noticed something else. The Japanese escort fighters moved with an agility that looked almost unreal. A month later, over the Philippines and Malaya, British and American pilots flying Brewster Buffaloes, P-40s, and other types found themselves outturned, outclimbed, and often outfought. Reports coming back from the front followed a grim pattern. Pilots described Japanese fighters that could turn indefinitely without stalling, that climbed like rockets, that appeared on their tails after a single missed attack. Dozens of Allied airmen died before they even fully understood what they were up against. The Zero's weaknesses existed, but in those early months few survived long enough to identify them. The aircraft was fragile, a few well-placed hits could set it ablaze. Its diving speed was limited. In a fast, steep descent, the control surfaces stiffened and the airframe approached its limits. But acknowledging those weaknesses required discipline and tactics that the Allies had yet to refine. Early in 1942, American Navy and Marine Corps squadrons in the Pacific fought with what they had, primarily the Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Sturdy, rugged, and thick-skinned, the Wildcat could not match the Zero's turn radius or climb rate. What it offered instead was armor, self-sealing tanks, and a tough airframe that absorbed punishment the Zero could not. In the right hands and with the right tactics, it could survive. But survive was very different from dominate. The early months of the Pacific War carved this lesson into American memory. Over Wake Island, the Philippines, Java, the Coral Sea, and in countless smaller skirmishes, the pattern repeated. Zeros slashed in, turned tightly, and hauled their noses around with apparent ease. American pilots learned, often the hard way, that to attempt a turning dogfight with a Zero was a near-certain death sentence. By mid-1942, however, something began to change. Hard experience forced adaptation. Pilots discovered that if they kept their speed high, dived aggressively, and refused the temptation to turn with the Zero, they could survive engagements and sometimes emerge victorious. Boom and zoom tactics, fast, slashing attacks followed by a climb back to safety, became the unofficial doctrine for those who wanted to live. Intelligence efforts also bore fruit. In June 1942, a Zero crash-landed relatively intact on Akitan Island in the Aleutians. Recovered and painstakingly repaired, it was test-flown by American pilots. For the first time, the United States had a pristine example of the enemy's premier fighter. Detailed evaluations followed. Test reports circulated quietly among engineers and tacticians. The Zero's phenomenal agility was real, but so were its structural limits and vulnerabilities at high speed. Even before Akitan, the U.S. Navy had already begun looking beyond the Wildcat. In 1941, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation on Long Island was working on a successor, a bigger, more powerful carrier fighter that could finally seize the advantage back from the Zero. The project would become the F-6F Hellcat. When the first Hellcat prototype flew in June 1942, the war was barely half a year old. Combat reports from the Coral Sea and Midway poured in, highlighting where the Wildcat struggled and where the Zero excelled. Designers and naval officers absorbed the data. They were not looking to create a delicate, high-strung thoroughbred. They wanted a killer, fast, hard-hitting, forgiving to fly, built to take hits and bring its pilot home. Step by step on blueprints and in wind tunnels, the idea of a Zero killer took form. Grumman's factory floor on Long Island earned a nickname during the war, the Iron Works. It was not because their planes were elegant, it was because they were tough. Engineers and test pilots there knew what reports from the front were saying. Wildcat pilots praised their aircraft's ruggedness, but they also described how it lost altitude and initiative in every sustained battle with the Zero. The new fighter would keep the survivability, but add something the Japanese had not yet had to face: superior power and speed wrapped in the same carrier-compatible package. The prototype that rolled out as the XF-6F1 in 1942 already hinted at this philosophy: bigger fuselage, broader wings, and space for more fuel and heavier armament. But it was the decision to fit the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an air-cooled radial engine of nearly 2,000 horsepower, that changed everything. With that single choice, the Hellcat was born. Test flights revealed a fighter that did not dance as delicately as the Zero in a slow, flat turn, but this new machine could dive harder, accelerate faster, and claw its way back into the sky with authority. It could absorb bullets that would rip a Zero apart. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns spat dense streams of lead, brutal at close range and still deadly at distance. When naval aviators first sat in its roomy cockpit, surrounded by armor plate and framed by thick glass, they knew someone had been listening. All of this development unfolded against a backdrop of a changing war. In the second half of 1942, on a jungle-covered island that few Americans had heard of before the war, the myth of Japanese invincibility was already beginning to crack. Over Guadalcanal in the bitter campaign for Henderson Field, Marine and Navy pilots flying Wildcats and other types fought day after day against Japanese Zeros and bombers. The Japanese still held many advantages, and their pilots were superb. Yet for the first time, they were being matched by an enemy that refused to break. American units learned the enemy's patterns. They plotted altitudes, timings, and approach paths. They experimented with tactics that exploited the Zero's weaknesses, staying fast, diving away, avoiding prolonged dogfights. They took terrible losses, but so did the Japanese, and for the Japanese, those losses cut deeper. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had fielded a relatively small but elite cadre of carrier pilots. Their training had taken years, their flying hours generous. Replacements graduated slowly, carefully, in small numbers. It was a system built for limited conflicts, not a vast industrial war. By late 1942 and through 1943, attrition began eating into that core of veterans. Experience that could never be replaced was lost in explosions over Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, and countless lesser-known engagements across the Solomons and New Guinea. The Allies, by contrast, treated pilot training as something to be scaled, industrialized, and standardized. In the United States, training command expanded relentlessly. More fields, more instructors, more aircraft. A flood of new aviators stepped onto the decks of carriers and into cockpit hatches, not as refined as Japan's pre-war elite, but good enough, and growing better as combat-hardened survivors returned to teach. By the time the first Hellcat-equipped squadrons reached the fleet in mid-1943, the broader balance in the Pacific was already beginning to tilt. The U.S. Navy's carrier force, shattered at Pearl Harbor, had been rebuilt and expanded. New Essex-class carriers joined the older Yorktown and Enterprise. Independence-class light carriers added more decks to the task forces. Each one needed fighters to protect it, and now those fighters would be Hellcats. In August 1943, F-6, F-3 Hellcats flew their first combat missions in a raid on Marcus Island. 2 months later, they took part in attacks on Wake Island. The encounters were small compared to the coming battles, but the pattern was clear. In the hands of trained pilots who understood their aircraft and their enemy, the Hellcat was formidable. Zeros could still win when they surprised their foes or caught them slow and low, but the effortless early war dominance was gone. Even as this shift unfolded, many Japanese aviators still believed deeply in the Zero. It had carried them through the triumphant first 6 months of the war. It had proven itself over China, Malaya, the Philippines, and the East Indies. Pilots who had survived those campaigns took pride in their ability to outfly any opponent. They saw American aircraft as heavy, clumsy machines relying on brute force and armor instead of skill. To them, the Zero remained the superior dogfighter, if only it was flown properly by a pilot worthy of it. But by 1943, cracks in that conviction were widening. Japanese industry struggled under blockade and resource shortages. New fighter designs, the A6M5 variants of the Zero, the Kaonishi N1KJ, Nakajima Kai-84 and others offered improvements but rarely reached the front in numbers sufficient to alter the course of the air war. Production of the Zero continued, refined but still constrained by the compromises of its original design. Armor remained minimal. Self-sealing fuel tanks were late and imperfect. Its pilots entered combat increasingly outnumbered. Meanwhile, American carrier doctrine evolved. Radar, once a novelty, became central to fleet defense. Fighter direction officers on carriers' flag bridges learned to read scopes and direct combat air patrol fighters onto incoming raids before they reached visual range. Hellcats could be vectored from altitude and position advantages their predecessors rarely enjoyed. It was no longer a simple contest between individual aircraft and pilots. It was a system war, with technology, training, and organization combining into a single killing apparatus. By early 1944, the U.S. advance across the Central Pacific accelerated. After the bloody capture of Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, American forces struck the Marshalls, Kwajalein, Roynammer, and Owetok. Carrier task forces roamed westward, striking Japanese bases with growing impunity. Hellcat squadrons, now standard on the decks of many carriers, fought again and again, gaining experience and piling up victories. In February 1944, the U.S. Navy launched a series of bold raids deep into what had once been secure Japanese territory. Among them was Operation Hailstone, the massive carrier attack on Truk Lagoon, the principal Japanese forward anchorage in the Central Pacific. Over 2 days, American aircraft devastated ships, aircraft, and facilities. Hellcats swept the skies, intercepting scrambling defenders and harrying them over their burning bases. Across the month, in raids spanning the Marshalls, Truk, and beyond, F-6F pilots shot down roughly 270 Japanese aircraft. For Japanese aviators, many of them newly trained and far less practiced than the veterans lost earlier in the war. The reality was brutal. The fighter that had once seemed untouchable was now being cut from the sky in unprecedented numbers. Yet statistics alone do not explain what had changed. To understand how the Zero's aura of invincibility collided with the cold efficiency of the Hellcat, it is necessary to examine the clash from several directions. Through the eyes of the pilots, the design of the machines, the tactics of the squadrons, and the strategies of the admirals who sent them into battle. For the men in the cockpits, none of this was abstract. Japanese naval aviators who strapped into the Zero in 1941 and 1942 carried the weight of a nation's hopes. Many had entered flight training as teenagers, enduring brutal discipline and relentless pressure. Instructors struck cadets for minor errors. Failures were not simply personal, they were seen as letting down the emperor. Those who survived emerged with a fierce sense of duty and an almost spiritual bond to their units. When these pilots first met Allied aircraft, their experiences reinforced everything they had been taught. They outturned British Buffaloes and Hurricanes over Malaya, danced around P-40s over the Philippines and New Guinea, and came home to airfields where ground crews and junior officers treated them like heroes. Under such conditions, it was easy to believe the Zero was not merely a fighter, but proof of Japanese superiority in the air. American naval aviators came from a different world. Their training was demanding and dangerous, but it was framed as a professional, technical career. Failure meant washing out, not disgrace. The culture prized initiative and problem-solving. When American pilots discovered that the Zero had the edge in a turning fight, they did not treat this as a spiritual challenge. They treated it as a tactical problem. By 1943 and 1944, that difference in mindset showed. Many of Japan's finest pre-war pilots were gone, replaced by hastily trained youngsters who entered combat haunted by the legends they had grown up hearing. They flew the same aircraft but without the same mastery. Across the ocean, a A rising tide of American pilots climbed into Hellcats with thousands of pages of tactics, intelligence summaries, and after-action reports behind them, and with the confidence that if they followed procedure and stayed with their wingmen, they might live long enough to grow old. Beneath these human stories lay the hard realities of metal, fuel, and design. The Zero's creators had pursued a radical vision, extreme range and agility above all. Every decision followed from that. The airframe was lightly built, the wings large and slender, the structure optimized for low weight rather than strength. Its 940 horsepower engine, light by Western standards, pulled a machine so lean that it could climb and turn with astonishing grace. For its time and place, it was a masterpiece of offensive design, built to strike far from home and win swift dogfights. The Hellcat was the opposite philosophy made flesh. From the outside it looked bulky, almost ungainly, but its thick wings hid fuel and ammunition. Its fuselage enclosed a robust structure. Heavy armor plates wrapped the cockpit. Self-sealing fuel tanks sloshed behind the pilot. The big R2800 engine at its nose drank fuel voraciously but returned speed, power, and the ability to dive and climb through a wide envelope. On paper, the Zero still retained advantages. At lower speeds and altitudes, it could outturn the Hellcat. It could often begin a climbing spiral with an edge. But combat seldom remained on paper. Real battles involved surprise, altitude advantage, sudden dives out of the sun, and the ever-present risk of structural failure. In those conditions, the Hellcat's ability to dive hard without tearing its wings off, to absorb hits without exploding, and to bring its pilot home again and again mattered more than a few degrees of extra turn. By 1944, the Zero was no longer facing the stubby Wildcat. It was facing an aircraft that could match or exceed its performance in most regimes that counted, while shielding the man inside with metal the Zero could never carry. That mismatch shaped the tactics that defined the coming clashes. In the early days, tactics favored the Zero. Japanese doctrine emphasized close, turning dogfights, mutual support within loose formations, and the exploitation of their fighters' climb and agility. They practiced high-side attacks, diving on bombers or slower fighters, then using their turn performance to regain position and initiative. Against unprepared opponents, this worked brutally well. American pilots quickly discovered that if they tried to meet the Zero on those terms, they died. Over the Coral Sea in Midway and later above Guadalcanal, survivors shared a simple, hard-earned rule: never dogfight a Zero in a level turn. Instead, they began to fight in the vertical. Making slashing attacks from above, they fired short bursts, then used speed and altitude to escape before the Zero could haul its nose around. This approach was refined and institutionalized. One of the most famous manifestations was the Thatch Weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch. Using pairs of fighters crossing back and forth, covered each other's tails, they forced any pursuer into the line of fire of the wingman. What had begun as an improvised solution to a frightening new threat became doctrine taught to new pilots. With the Hellcat, these tactics reached their full potential. The aircraft's superior dive, strong structure, and heavy guns made it ideal for hit-and-run attacks. Fighter direction from carriers guided by radar placed Hellcat formations above and ahead of incoming Japanese raids. Instead of scattered dogfights erupting randomly, interceptions became orchestrated. Squadrons attacked in cohesive groups, breaking up formations, then cutting down stragglers. On the Japanese side, tactical evolution was slower and more constrained. They refined formation flying and adjusted to American methods, but they lacked the same flow of fresh pilots and aircraft. Increasingly, they were forced to use their Zeros defensively, scrambling to meet American raids launched at times and places chosen by the enemy. Their tactics, once aggressive and confident, became reactive. Yet beyond pilots, cockpits, and turn circles, larger forces were shaping who would rule the Pacific sky. Those forces gathered first at the level of high command. Japanese naval leadership entered the Pacific War with a clear, aggressive doctrine. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, believed that Japan's only chance was to win rapid, decisive victories before American industry could fully mobilize. Carrier air power, fast-striking, long-ranging, built around aircraft like the Zero, was central to that plan. In 1941 and early 1942, it worked. The concentration of elite carrier air groups delivered blow after blow across the Pacific. But the very success of this strategy encouraged risk. Japanese carriers and their air groups were used intensively, hurled into repeated offensives that drained pilots and machines. The decisive battle Yamamoto sought at Midway instead crippled Japan's carrier arm. 4 fleet carriers and many of their best aviators were lost. Japan could replace the ships slowly. It could not easily replace the men. On the American side, Admirals Chester Nimitz, Raymond Spruance, And William Bull Halsey came to see carrier aviation less as a weapon for one grand showdown and more as a continuously regenerating spearhead. Task forces rotated, air groups trained, fought, reconstituted, losses were refilled from a deepening pool of pilots and aircraft. By 1943 and 1944, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, leading fast carrier task forces, commanded a tool Yamamoto had never truly possessed: a fleet air arm designed for sustained, attritional warfare. Japanese doctrine, rooted in the pursuit of decisive battle, struggled to adapt. As the war dragged on, their carriers were often held back for the hoped-for climactic clash, while land-based air units faced American raids alone. Those units flying largely Zeros and aging bombers were ground down piecemeal. When the decisive battles did come, Japan's air strength was already hollowed out. Hellcats would meet not the proud, veteran Zero force of 1941, but a weakened remnant stretched across too many fronts. Strategic vision, or its absence, was turning design and tactics into destiny. Underpinning all of this was the unforgiving arithmetic of industry and logistics. In 1941, Japan's aviation sector had achieved a remarkable feat by putting the Zero into mass production. Yet the system that produced it was fragile, dependent on limited supplies of high-grade aluminum, precision machine tools, and skilled labor. Japanese factories could build respectable numbers of aircraft, but reserves of raw materials were thin and transport vulnerable to submarine attack. Damage to factories or disruption of shipping lanes quickly translated into shortages at the front. The United States approached aviation like everything else in its war effort, as an industrial problem to be solved at scale. Assembly lines lengthened, subcontractors multiplied, aluminum poured out of new smelters, women riveters stepped into roles men had vacated for the front. Grumman's Ironworks was only one node in a vast network that churned out fighters, bombers, engines, and spare parts with relentless consistency. By the time the Hellcat entered full production, it did so into a system designed to support it. Crates of engines, wings, and landing gear stacked up at depots. Replacement aircraft waited on docks, ready to be hoisted aboard damaged carriers. Specialized repair ships shadowed task forces, able to patch battle-scarred fighters and return them to service in days. Logistics officers planned not for scarcity, but for abundance. The contrast grew sharper with every month. Japan introduced improved Zero variants and newer fighters, but struggled to equip even a fraction of its units with them. Production numbers, once comparable in scale, were outpaced several times over. Losses that might have been acceptable in a short war became catastrophic in a long one. For the Hellcat, this meant that each individual aircraft fought not alone but as part of a steady current. If one was lost, another would take its place. If a squadron was depleted, it could be swapped out and rebuilt. American pilots rotated home, taking their knowledge with them into training commands. Japanese pilots increasingly fought until they were killed. The balance of machines and men was mirrored by the balance of technology in the wider sense. At the start of the war, both sides flew by eye and instinct, guided over the ocean by dead reckoning, signal flares, and radio calls. By 1944, American carriers sailed with spinning radar antennas that could peer far beyond the horizon. The information they collected was funneled into cramped, dimly lit fighter direction centers where officers traced plots on transparent boards, tracking enemy raids as clusters of moving marks. When Japanese aircraft lifted off from islands like Truk or from distant carriers, they were often flying into a sky already mapped by enemy instruments. Long before pilots could see their targets, American controllers were vectoring Hellcat formations into position. Angels 20 bearing 090 bandits inbound. The interceptors climbed to meet the raiders with altitude and sun at their back. The age-old advantages of aerial combat now delivered by unseen electronics. Japan developed radar too, but later and on a smaller scale. Many forward bases and ships lacked it altogether. Those that had sets often used early models with limited range and reliability. Coordination between radar operators and fighter units never reached the same fluency as in American task forces. Where Allied technology amplified the effectiveness of every Hellcat squadron, Japanese Zeros frequently launched blind, only discovering the shape and size of incoming raids once they were already dangerously close. Technology also shaped survivability. American pilots depended on robust radios, standardized navigation aids, and rescue infrastructure. Submarines, seaplanes, and destroyers tasked with picking up downed airmen. Japanese pilots, particularly as the war ground on and resources thinned, could not rely on the same level of systemic support. A pilot who bilayed out over open ocean might be effectively written off. This knowledge seeped into morale, as surely as any official order. Morale, shaped by culture, ideology, and the drumbeat of victory or defeat, was the final invisible angle in the Zero Hellcat duel. For Japanese aviators, the early war had offered a narrative of rising destiny, a small island nation standing up to Western empires and winning. The Zero, with its long range and lethal agility, became a symbol of that story. Photographs of pilots beside their sleek fighters appeared in newspapers and propaganda posters. Tales of lone aces downing multiple enemies reinforced the idea that individual valor and superior spirit could overcome material odds. But war has a way of eroding myths. As losses mounted, the stories told in training barracks and briefing rooms grew harder to reconcile with reality. Younger pilots rushed through short courses, found themselves ordered into combat they were not truly prepared for in aircraft that no longer guaranteed superiority. They flew into skies where the enemy seemed to be everywhere, better armed, better coordinated, and present in unnerving numbers. On the American side, the narrative traveled in the opposite direction. Pilots who had grown up hearing of the Zero's dominance entered the war cautious, sometimes intimidated. Slowly, through hard experience and new machines, they gained the upper hand. Squadron-ready rooms that had once been haunted by stories of comrades lost to unseen Japanese fighters began to echo instead with reports of successful interceptions, of Hellcats coming home peppered with holes but intact. This shift carried a moral weight. Confronted with an enemy whose early war tactics had sometimes disregarded the lives of opponents and prisoners, American aviators developed their own hard edge. Air combat left little room for mercy. Burning aircraft fell whether the men inside had boasted of invincibility or stared in terror at their first taste of combat. Some Japanese pilots still clung to a code of honorable struggle. Others, particularly later in the war, were steered toward desperate measures, kamikaze attacks that fused aircraft and pilot into a single expendable weapon. The Hellcat Zero confrontation thus became more than just a contest of machines. It was a clash between two visions of war, one that exalted elite skill and spiritual resolve, another that harnessed industry, technology, and flexible doctrine. Both demanded courage. One increasingly demanded sacrifice against impossible odds. By early 1944, all of these strands, leadership choices, industrial might, tactical evolution, and fraying morale, converged over the vast emptiness of the Central Pacific. There, amid coral atolls and deep blue water, the Zero's waning legend would collide with the Hellcats' rising dominance in a series of violent, decisive encounters. Those encounters would begin in earnest in a single, devastating month, when Hellcats tore more than 200 Japanese aircraft from the sky and stripped away the last illusions of the Zero's invincibility. The month that shattered the Zero's legend began quietly, with carriers sliding west across an empty sea. In January 1944, the U.S. Navy's fast carrier task force, soon to be known as Task Force 58, assembled an armada unlike anything Japan had yet faced. Essex-class fleet carriers, Independence-class light carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers formed concentric rings of steel around a moving, floating airfield. On their decks waited hundreds of aircraft, and among them in growing numbers were F-6F Hellcats. Their first great test came in the Marshall Islands. The Marshalls, Kwajalein, Roynamar, and Enewetak, had been Japanese possessions for decades, part of the outer shield of their empire. Airfields on these coral atolls housed fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance planes meant to contest any Allied move through the Central Pacific. To break into this defensive belt, American planners knew they would have to sweep the sky clean. On 29 January 1944, before assault troops hit the beaches, the carriers moved into striking position. In the pre-dawn darkness, deck crews rolled Hellcats into place, chocks under wheels, wings folded against one another like sleeping birds. As the sun edged above the horizon, engines coughed, then roared to life in long, staggering lines. The launch cycle began. One by one, then in quick succession, Hellcats surged down the decks and clawed into the humid air. Their mission was simple: find and destroy Japanese air power in the Marshalls, on the ground, in the air, wherever it showed itself. Over Kwajalein and Roynamar, the first dogfights of the new campaign flickered into being. Japanese defenders scrambled in mixed formations, Zeros, older fighters, a handful of bombers. Many of their pilots had never before faced American carrier aviation at full strength. Some flew competently, even bravely. Others were raw, rushed into combat by a system straining to fill depleted squadrons. Hellcats arrived over their targets in disciplined groups, already benefiting from early radar warning and well-practiced fighter direction. They came in with altitude, with speed, and with the sun behind them. Diving through scattered clouds, they broke into Japanese formations, firing dense streams of .50 caliber rounds. Aircraft caught unaware disintegrated in seconds, wings shearing, fuel tanks exploding, engines tearing free from shattered mounts. The Zero's advantages, tight turning, nimble handling, still mattered when pilots managed to claw their way into a close, swirling fight. But more and more those battles unfolded on terms the Americans chose. Hellcat pilots avoided flat turns, refused to get drawn into circles. They struck, then climbed away, regrouped, and came back again. For the Japanese defenders, it was like trying to box with an opponent who hit from outside reach and never stayed in one place long enough to be pinned. By the first days of February, the Marshals' air defenses were effectively neutralized. As assault troops came ashore on Kwajalein and Roynammer, Hellcats circled overhead, intercepting scattered attempts at reinforcement or retaliation. Bombers struck airstrips and fuel depots. Fire and black smoke boiled up from what had once been proud outposts of the Japanese mandate. Carrier pilots returned to their decks with stories that circulated quickly in wardrooms and ready rooms. The new fighter worked. It could dive through flak shred interceptors and come home with holes in its skin that would have ripped a Zero apart. Losses were not absent, no air war is bloodless, but the balance of exchange was something no Allied pilot of 1942 would have recognized. Yet the Marshals were only the beginning. Even as these battles were being fought, another target loomed on charts in Pacific Fleet headquarters, Truk Lagoon. Truk in the Caroline Islands was the Japanese Navy's great forward anchorage, a vast natural harbor ringed by islands and coral. Before the war it had been built up as a central bastion, a place where warships could anchor, refuel, and rearm, and where land-based aircraft could project power in every direction. American planners called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. By early 1944, it was a vital hub for Japanese logistics and air operations. To advance deeper into the Central Pacific, the Americans could not leave such a base intact on their flank. The plan to strike Truk, Operation Hailstone, was ambitious. Task Force 58 would sweep in, hit the lagoon and its airfields with overwhelming force, destroy as many ships and aircraft as possible, then withdraw before Japan's scattered remaining carriers could react in strength. It would be a test not just of the Hellcats' capabilities but of the entire fast carrier concept. In mid-February 1944, Mitcher's carriers approached Truk over an ocean slate gray with winter swells. Below deck, ordnance crews wheeled bombs into position. Aviation mechanics checked engines and fuel lines, patched flak damage from the Marshals, and chalked kill marks beneath canopies. Pilots studied aerial photographs of Truk's airstrips, seaplane ramps, and mooring buoys. Dawn on 16 February broke over a task force already in motion. Radar screens lit up with the outlines of Truk's islands as the first waves of Hellcats, dive bombers, and torpedo planes launched into a sky streaked with low clouds. The Hellcats' role was clear: sweep the skis. As the sun climbed, Japanese radar stations and lookouts on Truk's perimeter islands finally caught sight of the incoming formations. Sirens wailed, air raid warnings blared, pilots sprinted to their aircraft. In the frantic minutes that followed, a patchwork of fighters clawed into the air. A-6M-Zeros from various air groups, some veteran, many not, along with other types pressed into service as interceptors. They rose into a trap they could not yet see. Guided by carrier-based fighter direction, Hellcat squadrons approached the lagoon in layered formations. Some flew high cover, others mid-level, still others dropped down to strafe airfields and floatplane bases. When the first Japanese fighters appeared, climbing hard, they found themselves already under attack. Hellcats stooped from superior altitude, diving past the fragile Zeros with guns blazing. In the initial clashes, confusion reigned. Japanese formations broke apart, pilots jinking and turning, trying to bring their nimble aircraft to bear on attackers that had already flashed through. Some succeeded, momentarily latching onto a Hellcat's tail, only to find their shots glancing off metal that would have destroyed a Zero. The sky over Truk filled with weaving contrails, expanding blossoms of black flak, and the arching trails of burning planes spiraling down. From below, island garrisons watched as their own fighters fought and fell against a relentless onslaught. Within hours, it became less a battle than a series of executions. Hellcats roamed almost at will, pouncing on any aircraft that tried to take off or escape. Bombers attempting to flee Truk were intercepted and shot down over open water. On the ground, parked aircraft were strafed and bombed where they sat. Fuel dumps and ammunition stores erupted, sending thick columns of smoke boiling into the sky. Across 2 days, 16 and 17 February, Task Force 58 pounded Truk. Dive bombers and torpedo planes went after shipping inside the lagoon, crippling or sinking cruisers, destroyers, auxiliaries, and transports. Hellcats provided top cover, tangling with any surviving defenders and finishing off damaged aircraft. By the end of Operation Hailstone, American reports credited Hellcat pilots with more than 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air over Truk and surrounding areas. Including those wrecked on the ground, the total number of Japanese aircraft lost in the raid climbed higher still. And Truk's defenders were not alone. In the same month as operations rippled across the Central Pacific, Hellcats flying from U.S. carriers and forward bases added dozens more kills over other islands and outposts. Taken together, in that brief, devastating stretch of 1944, Hellcat squadrons claimed roughly 270 Japanese aircraft destroyed. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the effect was shattering. Truk, once a symbol of forward strength, had been laid open and gutted from the air. Its surviving ships withdrew. Its air garrison, once a serious threat, had been slaughtered. What remained of its power ebbed away in the months that followed, leaving only a hollowed-out base bypassed by the American advance. For Japanese pilots, the shock ran deeper than facilities lost or aircraft destroyed. The raids on the Marshalls and Truk proved that even in heavily defended skis, even when supported by ground-based radar and flak, their Zeros could be overwhelmed by Hellcats flown in numbers, under disciplined tactical control. The myth of invincibility, already frayed, tore wide open. Yet the story of the Zero's downfall and the Hellcats' supremacy did not end over Truk's lagoon. The destruction of hundreds of aircraft in that month was a prelude, a brutal demonstration of what happened when the two machines and the systems behind them clashed at scale. A few months later, in June 1944, that clash would erupt on an even grander stage, in what would be remembered as the most one-sided carrier-air battle in history. June 1944, the Marianas. Thousands of miles west of Hawaii, American transports and landing craft crowded the waters off Saipan. Marines and soldiers fought their way inland through cane fields and ridges. To Japanese high command, the meaning was unmistakable. If the Marianas fell, American B-29 bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The response was Operation Ago, the decisive battle long promised, now forced into being. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa sailed from the Philippines in the Western Pacific with what remained of Japan's carrier striking power, the Mobile Fleet. 9 carriers including Teiho, Shikaku, and Zuikaku. Hundreds of aircraft. On paper it was formidable. In reality, the pilots who manned its cockpits were not the hardened veterans of Pearl Harbor or the Indian Ocean. Many were products of short training programs, with far fewer flying hours than their predecessors. Facing them was Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, covering the Saipan invasion. 15 American carriers, about 900 aircraft, more than half of them Hellcats. Radar picket ships fanned out ahead. Fighter direction officers studied greenlit scopes in cramped compartments, tracing the arcs of distant contacts. At dawn on 19 June 1944, the Philippine Sea looked deceptively calm. Swells rolled under a hazy sky. Far to the west, beyond the horizon, Ozawa's carriers turned into the wind and began launching waves of aircraft, Zeros as fighters and fighter bombers, along with dive bombers and torpedo planes. Their plan relied on long range, strike the American fleet from beyond the reach of U.S. carrier aircraft, using the newly captured airfields of Guam and other islands as stepping stones. They never got the chance. American radar picked up the first raids at long range. In the fighter direction centers of carriers like Lexington and Enterprise, officers converted blips into vectors. Orders went out. Hellcats clawed into the sky, forming long, climbing lines above the task force. At altitude, they spread into combat air patrols, waiting for the inbound formations. The first Japanese raid approached around mid-morning, a loose mass of aircraft sweeping in from the west-southwest. As they neared Guam, some detached to refuel and regroup. Hellcats from land-based and carrier squadrons already stationed over the island dove on them. Above Guam's rugged hills, the air turned into a slaughter. Hellcats attacked in disciplined sections, diving from superior altitude using speed and firepower to tear into the Japanese formation. Zeros tried to turn inside them to transform the engagement into the tight dogfights they still trusted. Many never got the chance. A Hellcat's 6.50 caliber guns firing in brief, controlled bursts could shred a lightly built Zero in a heartbeat. Pilots later recalled scenes of aircraft filling their gun sights, of wings snapping off and fuel tanks erupting. Once, such memories had belonged to Japanese pilots describing early war victories. Now they were American. Of the first large raid, a significant portion was destroyed or scattered before it ever reached the American fleet. Those that pressed on flew into yet more layers of interceptors. A handful dove through and attacked, dropping bombs near battleships or driving torpedoes into the sea, but hits were rare. The bulk of their comrades fell in flames. By midday, additional Japanese raids followed, each meeting the same fate. Radar tracks bloomed, then thinned. Each new group of attackers triggered launches from the carriers, more Hellcats racing out to meet them. The sky between Ozawa's force and Mitcher's fleet became a killing ground. Within the American formations, discipline held. Pilots maintained altitude advantages, avoided turning duels, covered each other's tails. When Zeros managed to latch onto a Hellcat, the American fighter's rugged construction often gave its pilot a second chance. Damaged Hellcats limped home with torn control surfaces and punctured fuel tanks, their pilots battered but alive. For the Japanese, the day unfolded as a series of terrible surprises. Training had promised that attack in massed formations would break through enemy defenses. Instead, their formations dissolved under wave after wave of interceptors. What reached the American task force was a fraction of what had launched. Carrier decks that should have been crowded with returning aircraft stayed disturbingly empty. It was on this day that one American aviator reportedly likened the one-sided air battles to an old-time turkey shoot. The phrase, passed from mouth to mouth and filtered through post-war retelling, would become the enduring name for the engagement, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. While Hellcats hunted in the air, other blows fell from below the waves. American submarines operating ahead of the carrier screen found the Mobile fleet. The submarine Albacore torpedoed the new carrier Tejo, flagship of Ozawa's force. Hours later, internal explosions from leaking fumes tore her apart. Another submarine, Kavala, hit Shikaku with a spread of torpedoes. Engulfed in fire and explosions from aviation fuel and bombs, she sank beneath the Philippine Sea. Japan's naval air power was being consumed from every angle, its carriers gutted by submarines, its aircraft butchered by Hellcats. The next day, 20 June, the battle entered its final phase. Ozawa, recognizing the devastation of his air groups, began to withdraw westward. Mitcher, determined to capitalize on the victory, launched a massive, long-range strike late in the afternoon, pushing his air groups almost to the limit of their fuel to reach the retreating enemy. Hellcats led the way as fighter cover for dive bombers and torpedo planes. The sun dipped toward the horizon as they found Ozawa's carriers. In the fading light, they plunged into anti-aircraft fire, attacking ships already reeling from the previous day's losses. Bomb and torpedo hits set the carrier Hio ablaze and damaged others. Hellcats tangled with the last defending Zeros and provided top cover as American strike planes clawed their way out of the maelstrom. On the return flight, many American pilots ran out of fuel in the darkness. Mitcher took the unprecedented step of ordering his carriers to turn on their deck lights, illuminating the sea despite the risk of submarine attack to guide them in. Dozens of aircraft still ditched short of the task force, their crews bobbing in the black swells as rescue ships searched through the night. Even in victory, the air war remained a dangerous, unforgiving business. But by then, the outcome was beyond doubt. Across 2 days of combat, Japanese naval aviation suffered losses from which it would never recover. Carrier air arms that had taken years to build were wiped out in hours. Post-war analyses vary in their precise numbers, but the broad picture is consistent. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed, many of them Zeros or their later variants, against much smaller American losses. Hellcats formed the backbone of the U.S. fighter effort, credited by wartime tallies with the majority of air-to-air kills. When the surviving Japanese carriers limped away from the Philippine Sea, many of their decks were nearly bare, their hangars echoing shells. They would sail again in later operations, but often as little more than decoys, lacking the trained air groups that had once made them so lethal. The decisive carrier duel that Yamamoto had imagined years earlier had come at last, and ended in one of the most lopsided defeats in naval history. What began in early 1944, with Hellcats methodically tearing apart Japanese air power over the Marshalls and Truk, found its grim crescendo over the Philippine Sea. The boast that the Zero was unbeatable in combat had not survived contact with a new reality. A better balanced fighter, backed by overwhelming industrial strength, radar-directed tactics, and a training system that could sustain heavy combat indefinitely. In the space of a few months, a legend had been dismantled, not by rhetoric but by fire and falling wreckage across thousands of miles of sky. The consequences would ripple far beyond the carcasses of carriers and the silent wrecks resting on coral or seabeds. They would reshape Japanese strategy, American confidence, and the very nature of air warfare in the Pacific. In the silence that followed the guns, the shape of the war in the Pacific was different. At Truk, the change was visible from the ground. The lagoon that had once been crowded with hulls lay strangely empty. Burned-out shipwrecks smoked along the reefs. Airfields that had bustled with takeoffs and landings were littered with twisted frames and scorched wings. Hangars gaped open, roofs peeled back by bomb blasts. What aircraft remained were often unflyable, damaged, short of parts, or stranded by a lack of fuel. Japanese records and post-war surveys suggest that Operation Hailstone destroyed or rendered useless roughly 250 aircraft in and around Truk, many of them Zeros or their successors. Dozens more had been lost in the Marshalls and other February actions. In the span of that single month, Japanese naval aviation in the Central Pacific had been mauled. The figure of some 270 aircraft shot down or destroyed in combat by Hellcat squadrons across these operations was not just a statistic. It was a measure of lives lost, of units erased, of an air defense network abruptly hollowed out. The strategic consequences were immediate. Truk, once hailed by Japanese planners as an impregnable bastion, was effectively neutralized. Its surviving garrison remained, but its ability to influence the campaign fell away. The base was bypassed, left to wither under occasional bombardment and blockade as the American advance leapfrogged westward. Without strong air cover from forward bases like Truk and the Marshalls, Japanese forces in the Central Pacific lost the ability to contest the air above the sea. 4 months later, the Philippine Sea finished what Truk had begun. The Battle of the Philippine Sea cost Japan something that could not be rebuilt in any meaningful sense: its trained carrier air groups. Estimates vary, but of the roughly 430 carrier aircraft Ozawa committed, the vast majority were lost. Land-based units on Guam and other islands added further losses. American figures claimed around 476 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air and on the ground over the course of the battle and its associated operations, against around 130 American planes lost, many of those to fuel exhaustion and ditchings rather than enemy fire. Behind those numbers lay an irreplaceable core of experience. In 1941, a Japanese naval aviator might have logged 700 or more flight hours before combat. By mid-1944, desperate to fill depleted squadrons, training programs had been compressed. Some pilots reached the front with a fraction of that time, and little practice in complex carrier operations or coordinated tactics. The Philippine Sea consumed not just aircraft, but the last sizable contingent of pilots still capable of fighting at something like pre-war standards. American losses, though painful, were sustainable. Hellcat pilots who survived the Philippine Sea brought home not only victories but hard-earned tactical refinements. Their experiences were folded back into training manuals, lectures, and simulator sessions. The system that had produced them remained intact, ready to generate more. For the Japanese Navy, the aftermath was bleaker. In internal reports and post-war testimony, officers acknowledged the scale of the disaster. The Mobile fleet, far from delivering a decisive blow, had been rendered a hollow instrument. Carriers like Zuikaku returned to port with flight decks nearly bare. Ozawa later remarked that he still had ships but no air groups to operate from them. The phrase captured a brutal truth: Japan's carrier weapon, the spearhead of its early war strategy, had been broken. Strategically, the fall of Saipan in July 1944, secured in part by American air supremacy, compounded this defeat. From the Marianas, U.S. Army Air Force's B-29s could now reach Tokyo and other industrial centers. Japan's inner defensive ring had been pierced. Without a functioning carrier arm or strong outer island air defenses, there was no effective way to push that threat back out to sea. At sea level, American sailors and pilots sensed the shift even before the admirals wrote it down. Carrier task forces steamed closer to Japanese-held coasts. Raids that would once have been considered reckless penetrated deep into enemy-held waters. Hellcats now flew not only as fleet defenders but as roaming predators, sweeping over airfields from the Rukias to Formosa, hunting any remaining resistance. For Japanese aviators, the psychological impact was profound. Before 1943, many had believed, often with reason, that in a fair fight, plane for plane, pilot for pilot, they held the edge. After the February raids in the Philippine Sea, that belief was hard to sustain. Surviving pilots returned to find squadron rosters slashed, friends missing, replacement aircraft and parts scarce. Rumors of catastrophic losses spread faster than official communiques. The Zero was still respected, still loved by those who flew it, but fewer and fewer believed it could turn the tide on its own. The sense of flying an unbeatable machine had been replaced by a harsher awareness. They were now going to war in an outclassed aircraft under a darkening sky. And in that darkness, Japanese strategy began to take a more desperate shape, one that would ask of pilots not just skill, but their lives as a matter of policy. That darker shape took form in late 1944, off the Philippines. Operation Ago had failed, the Mobile fleet had been mauled, Saipan had fallen, and with it, direct access for American bombers to the Japanese homeland. In Tokyo, the naval air arm that had once planned bold carrier raids now faced a different set of calculations. If Japan could no longer win control of the air through maneuver and attrition, perhaps it could still break American will through shock. In October 1944, as U.S. forces landed on Leyte in the central Philippines, a new tactic emerged from staff rooms and conference tables: organized suicide attacks by aircraft. The Special Attack Units Takatai were conceived as a way to turn dwindling resources into maximum effect. A single aircraft flown intentionally into an American ship might succeed where conventional strikes had failed. The Zero, long the symbol of offensive reach and aerial grace, was now repurposed as a guided weapon. On 25 October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the first major wave of kamikaze attacks fell upon the American fleet. Pilots, many in aging Zeros patched together from limited stocks, dove into the maelstrom of flak and fighter interception. Some were shot down by Hellcats before they could reach their targets, others slipped through. The effect on the U.S. Navy was jolting. Ships survived near misses and conventional bomb hits with increasing regularity thanks to improved damage control and armor. But a Zero packed with explosives, flown at full throttle into a carrier's flight deck or a destroyer's bridge, could inflict devastating local damage. Hulls buckled, fires raged, casualty lists lengthened. For Hellcat pilots, the nature of the air war shifted. No longer were they only dueling enemy fighters in the high, clear air over blue water. They were now interceptors in a race against time, scrambling to shoot down attackers who did not intend to come back. Over Luzon, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, Hellcats and other American fighters flew relentless combat air patrols, orbiting above the fleet in invasion beaches. Radar picket destroyers extended the fleet's sensing horizon, but also drew the brunt of kamikaze attention. When warnings crackled over the radio, bogies inbound, Hellcats plunged toward specks on the radar scopes, trying to break up incoming formations before they scattered and dived. They did so with grim efficiency. Many of the kamikaze aircraft were flown by pilots with minimal training, sometimes in worn-out Zeros whose performance no longer matched the type's early war reputation. Hellcat kill tallies climbed further, yet the cost of any aircraft they missed could be measured in burning steel and human lives. By the war's final year, the arc of the Zero's story was stark. Once it had ranged far beyond the reach of its enemies, escorting bombers deep into hostile skis. Now it was increasingly confined to desperate final stands, thrown against American carrier groups in suicide attacks, or sent up in small numbers to challenge the high-flying B-29s that roared over the home islands. Against those bombers, the Zero struggled. Designed for agility at medium altitudes and moderate speeds, it was out of its element in thin, cold air above 25,000 feet. Pilots pushed their aging engines to the limit, sometimes managing to rake a bomber with fire, more often falling away. More modern Japanese fighters like the Nakajima Kai-84 and Kawanishi N-1KJ would prove more capable interceptors, but they arrived late in limited numbers, hampered by fuel shortages and manufacturing problems. The Hellcat II had evolved. Later variants like the F6 F5 incorporated improvements in engine power, visibility, and armament. Field modifications and factory upgrades turned the Hellcat into a versatile fighter bomber, carrying rockets and bombs against ground targets while still dominating the air. It served from carriers and from hastily built island airfields, its broad wings and strong landing gear forgiving of rough strips. By war's end, Hellcats were credited by U.S. Navy tallies with destroying more than 5,000 enemy aircraft in the Pacific, a majority of all Navy air-to-air victories. Even allowing for the overclaiming common to all sides, the kill ratio remained staggering. Conservative post-war analyses still place the Hellcat's air-to-air exchange rate at well over 10-to-1 in its favor. Against the Zero specifically, that disparity had a deeper meaning. What had begun as a duel between two fighters became a symbol of the way the war itself had turned. The aircraft that once gave Japan its cutting edge had been overtaken by a machine that embodied the full weight of American industrial capacity, tactical doctrine, and adaptability. Individual Japanese pilots continued to fight with courage until the end. Some became aces even in 1944 and 1945, snatching victories under impossible conditions. But they did so swimming against a tide that no amount of personal skill could reverse. In August 1945, as the war ground to its close under the shadow of atomic bombs and Soviet entry, the one-Sprout Zero sat in scattered clusters on airfields from Rabaul to Kyushu. Many were grounded for lack of fuel or parts. Others had been dug into revetments, camouflaged against air attack that never came. A few were prepared for last-ditch suicide sorties that would never be flown. American survey teams, moving through captured bases, studied the wreckage and the survivors. Where Allied pilots in 1942 had stared in fear and fascination at the Zero's sleek lines, engineers in 1945 measured its light structure and thin skin against the robust frames of Hellcats and other late-war Allied types. What had once been a terrifying unknown was now an artifact, still elegant, but visibly a product of an earlier phase of the war. For the Hellcat, the end came more quietly. With peace, many were scrapped or relegated to training and secondary duties. A few found second lives in foreign air forces or as post-war racers. Others became static displays, parked on museum floors beneath polished lights, their blue paint and white stars a faint echo of the sun-glared flight decks and cramped ready rooms they had once known. The story of the Zero and the Hellcat did not end entirely with the last dogfight or the final kamikaze sortie. It lingered in memoirs, in technical analyses, in the way future generations of pilots and designers thought about what air superiority really meant. And it lingers in a single stark contrast. A fighter hailed as unbeatable in 1941, brought low within a few years by a rival that combined solid design with a system built to sustain and improve it. Yet behind the statistics of kills and losses, the shattered myths and new doctrines, lies a deeper question. What does this reversal tell us about the nature of modern war and about the people who fought and died inside these machines? In the end, the duel between the Zero and the Hellcat was never just about two airplanes. It was about what happens when belief meets reality, when the faith of a nation in a single weapon is tested against a world that refuses to stand still. In 1941, the Zero embodied a particular vision of war, that superior skill, courage, and an exquisitely tuned machine could overcome heavier odds. For a time, that vision held. Young Japanese pilots rose into unfamiliar skies and came home victorious, convinced that spirit and discipline had carried them through. But modern war is a moving target. While those early victories unfolded, factories thousands of miles away were learning, adjusting, changing their outputs from Wildcats to Hellcats, from hasty tactics to codified doctrine. Intelligence officers dissected wrecks. Instructors rewrote syllabi. Radar operators refined their craft. The Hellcat was not just a better fighter, it was the visible edge of a vast, adaptive system. Zero did not suddenly become a bad airplane in 1944. It was the same elegant, lethal machine that had stunned Allied pilots in 1941. What changed was everything around it. The quality of its pilots, the strength of its logistics, the coherence of its strategy, the resilience of the nation that built it. The Hellcat's triumph was less a story of one design defeating another than of one system outlasting and overwhelming its opponent. Yet inside both machines were men with beating hearts, limited training, private fears. Some believed the aircraft under them was unstoppable. Others knew quietly that it was not and flew anyway. In the clash of Zero and Hellcat, myths were shattered, but courage was not the preserve of either side. Today, in museums and rusting wrecks on tropical seabeds, the remnants of that rivalry sit in silence. Visitors read placards listing speeds, armament, and kill ratios. The numbers are impressive, they are also incomplete. Because beneath every statistic, 270 aircraft shot down in a month, hundreds more over the Philippine Sea, there is the same lesson, that no weapon is unbeatable, that technology divorced from a sustainable system will fail, and that human lives are the true currency in which such beliefs are tested. The Zero's legend and the Hellcat's record are two halves of a single story of how quickly supremacy can fade, and how ruthlessly modern war exposes the difference between what a nation hopes is true and what, in the cold sky, actually is.